It's the Polo Podcast.
Hello, everybody. Andrew here, Polo Reef. Another podcast interview with legends and pioneers in this industry. First, we have a very special guest all the way from Long Island, New York. Probably traveled 10 minutes to get here.
And I was a little late.
And he late. Makes many of Polo Reef's products, the original and probably best two-part in the market. Bob Stark from ESV. With me here also, the last Magna Aquarist of the Year award. Hopefully it won't be the last. Another pioneer in the industry, writing magazine articles and books, Mike Paletta.
You're saying I'm old then.
I'm just saying you're older than me.
Yeah, 1986 is the year I wrote the first article for C-Scope.
There you go, 1980.
Kind of scary.
Yeah.
What was that, 80s?
1986.
Wow, right.
That's the first lecture I gave was for the Marine Aquarium Society of Toronto.
And that was before the book.
Yeah, the book was in 2000, and I'm actually working on a new ebook for beginners.
Tell everybody, what was that book called?
That was the New Marine Aquarium,
Right.
where I basically outlined the shift over from dead coral skeletons and undergravel filters to the technology we're using today. And obviously, 20 years later, we've changed things dramatically. So
Time for another book.
Time for another book.
You may want to wait for some of this new stuff to really is.
Well, no, this is a beginner's book. I'm not getting a beginner's trapped in the microbiome. No.
And then there was Ultimate Marine Aquarium.
Then there was Ultimate Marine Aquarium, where I showed 50 of the nicest tanks that I knew of and the technology, and incorporated all their technology into an explanation of this is the level you should keep this at, and this is the lighting and everything else.
And now you are writing articles for Reef Builders as well as Still Coral Magazine?
Occasionally for Coral Magazine,
Right.
for Ultramarines in England, and for Tropical Fish Hobbyist for the beginners in that group.
Gotcha.
Paletta. Okay, Mike, start it off.
So it's been almost a year since we saw you, Bob.
Yes.
So we always have interesting conversations. So I'm curious, what are you up to now? What are you working on?
Well, my primary thing is getting orders out on time, which is taking a lot. we've really been busy. And but as far as new things, basically from the get-go, I wanted to get into reefing with the minimal amount of stuff to better understand what each thing does. And to your credit, and I appreciate, you knew that about me, and my tank was one of the tanks in the Ultimate. It was called the bare bones tank.
Right.
And it was just, a hot
Probably run
magnum.
bleach with bleach, right?
No, we didn't get the bleach.
No sump, no skimmer, just
I didn't get the bleach at that
simple.
time. But yeah, it was just a hot magnum, no skimmer, very light fish load, and we could talk about that maybe later in the group thing. But I remember Craig and all the Northeast guys coming over to see it, and Craig taking water samples, and it was like one of the lowest phosphate levels, because everybody expected it to have high, but it didn't. So that kind of showed you can get into some kind of a balance with these tanks. And we're seeing that more currently these days we're struggling to keep nutrients up and things like that. And so I have a product I'm working on now that might be used in conjunction with some water changes, not huge water changes, that might allow people to supplement and not have to worry about overdose and not have to spend so much money on ICP testing. So it might be another
I think
thing.
maybe I even gave you that idea.
Well,
in your sleep.
yes, the fluffing
The fluff.
gave me that. That was the genesis
The
of
fluff.
it. He was getting our seawater, and then he was adding a few little extra elements to it, and I'm like, he might be onto something with that. So that's based off of that. We have.
Am I going to get royalties?
We'll discussion a little later about that.
it's free salt.
That would be bigger than a revenue number.
You get customized microbrew batches.
Now you guys have been in doing this with me pretty much as long as I've been doing this. We're basically OG reefers, and I did.
I'm a half a generation below.
Okay, we'll give you
All
that.
right, half.
Half. Okay.
So yeah, I'm sorry. What you
I was going to say, because I did an article on what's old is new again.
Yes.
Where People are starting to look at halides again. People are looking at better mechanical filtration. And the interesting one is a lot of people shifted over to not doing water changes, back to doing water changes.
Right.
What's your philosophy on water changes? What's the pros and cons? And
then get into the whole organic side, because that's the way this is
I
going.
think,
nobody really talks about that.
Right, that's where this is
because
going.
we're not measuring it.
Right.
So
And
it's something we don't measure.
Well, is there an easy way to measure organics? We now do ICP.
Well, I'll be
the
talking to
UV
Craig about that
spectrometer, maybe?
later, but Craig would know a lot about that, so we can talk to him about that. But
okay, back to water changes.
So yeah, water changes. What I'm a little nervous about is when I hear you don't need to do a water change if you can keep all the inorganic trace elements on point. And that's like the only purpose of the water change. But that's not true. Anybody who's done a water change, if you put water in that white bucket and you look down and you see yellow, that's organics. And then we have to say, what's the effect of those organics?
Or you see massive amounts of detritus that
yeah,
take up dead spots.
That's a great way to do a water change.
And then when you mix up a nice batch of ESV salt, fresh,
And put that next to it.
in a white vat, it's so crystal blue.
Right.
Right?
That's so. What are
Yes.
those? So the next question is, what's the effect of those organics? How much of those dissolved organics are in there? And a great study that was done was it Ken Feldman from Penn State?
Yep.
That, I think everybody has to go find that and reread that today, because it's gold. He tested dissolved organics. He cited references that showed, I'm pulling this kind of out of my hat right now, but like natural reef water is like 1 part per million dissolved organic, and there's studies where they just brought it up to a little over 2, and the corals did horrible. And we're not testing for that. So, and dissolved organics, there's all different kinds. You know, you have the labile ones that break down very rapidly, and then you have the yellowing, which are more the humic compounds, which will tend to linger in the ocean. Some of them linger for thousands of years. But they all play an important part in trace elements, the inorganic trace elements. So, you know, when I hear things like this element causes this color and the corals will do better if this level is here, we're ignoring the fact that we don't know what's going on with the organics, and the organics play an important role because they chelate a lot of these things. You're not going to get very high inorganic iron levels in a newly mixed batch of salt water because there's no organics to solubilize it. But in your tank, you can get it pretty high. And some of those organics help certain organisms get the trace elements. Other organics actually protect the organism from being poisoned by them. So like a classic example would be copper. Copper, inorganic copper, and we can get back to this. This gets into how do they come up with those allowable levels on the ICPs? Because open ocean levels of copper, not even the MS would pick that up.
Right.
It's like 0.003
Right.
copper.
Right.
So organisms have actually evolved organics to protect them from copper. There's certain phytoplankton that can be poisoned from seawater levels of copper. So, you know, and the other thing is the idea that the ocean contains the same elements all in this constant ratio. Mm-hmm. When it comes to trace elements, you're talking more like nutrient type things. And that every reef has its own unique influence of that. Anthropological elements coming in and, you know, upwellings, how close is the reef to an upwelling? How pure is the open ocean water coming in over it? So all of these little ratios and things, I bet if you really did a study on all the reefs, they're all over the map, which gets into, are those ratios important versus how most of them are getting their trace elements anyway, which is food, which is another thing
Which is our
I'm
future
working
topic.
on.
We're going to talk about the bacterial
And,
influence
yeah.
on trace elements in a bit.
Right.
But it gets to the ocean. People have this philosophy that their reef is a little mini part of the ocean. Other than Andrew's tank, which may be the closest thing I've seen to a mini part, But if you look at the biological load compared to the massive amount of water
Right.
with parts per billion of trace elements constantly washing across it,
Yes.
it's not the same.
And food organisms.
And food organisms, we don't have the live phyto and zooplankton floating around in our tanks. If you look at the parts per million of those versus what we have in our tanks,
Right.
we basically have no live material. Everything we have is inorganic. Consequently, it's a completely different organism that is a reef tank versus the ocean.
Right.
And to think the two are the same. So
Right.
we have to change the philosophy of we have to manage this as not a part of the ocean, but as
Right.
its own little entity.
Well, it's a model ecosystem. We're attempting to create a model of it. We're never going to duplicate the natural thing. And it's a model, and we don't really have a good instruction manual on how to make that model. So we have to, it just kind of makes it interesting, though, because now you have to go out looking at studies from the natural ecosystem and see if there's any like pieces of the puzzle that could be used. But it's not, you can't just replicate.
I would bet you that if some of these concoctions actually do work, and or we figured a way to get live zoo plankton dosed on a doser
Right.
into the tank. I mean, there was a guy that was dosed yeast like
I
a
did-
drip method or
That makes a
something.
lot of sense.
I did live-
And you're feeding the coral way more naturally. That's where this is going some
Right.
point.
Right.
I did live rotifers. I raised the cultured and did rotifers for a year. The problem was the amount of time I spent doing that took away from me just being able to sit and enjoy the tank.
I understand.
And so you got to say,
Right.
okay,
You got to keep it simple.
monkeying around with this. Yeah, the rule in life, particularly for reef tanks, is the simpler it is, the more likely you are to do it.
Right.
Once the maintaining and having the phytoplankton crash and having to redo it, having the rotifers crash, having to redo it, it was no longer a simple system. I became less and less inclined to do it over the
Right.
long term.
Exactly.
And that's how everything is. I mean, even if you have a skimmer, if you can't clean the cup easily, you don't do it as regularly, the skimmer isn't as efficient.
Right, exactly.
So keep things as simple as you can. You're more likely to do it. It's more likely to be successful. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. The simpler we can make these systems, this one notwithstanding,
Right.
the better off we are.
And if we make them simpler, and part of that is we remove equipment maybe that we always thought we needed, or maybe we add something,
Right.
it forces us to become more knowledgeable over the chemistry, the reef ecology, and all that. Because if we want that stuff built into the system, we need to understand that. Which is the greatest thing about this hobby is, that's what happened in the early days.
And let's be truthful here. The part of this game we don't understand is this whole microbiome, the effect of the bacteria, and we're just starting to scratch
Right.
the surface
Right.
of
Right.
this stuff now.
Yes.
So-
Yeah, I mean, the two things I think are the least understood in the hobby are coral diseases and coral nutrition.
Right.
And the microbiome probably plays more of a role in it than we ever thought, in
Absolutely.
that corals have really not evolved a whole lot in 200 million years. Why? Because they haven't had to. They have a very efficient system where they can literally farm the bacteria and the other organisms around them to benefit themselves. And as long as conditions are stable, they do this farming. I mean, it sounds counterintuitive to how simple an organism
And we're
can do this.
sprinkling reefroids
It's part
twice
of
a
the,
week,
yeah.
right? Like that. That's not what happens.
No,
The whole reef is evolved to recycle efficiently. And we always used to look at that as, it's just the zooxanthellae is creating the thing from the land. But now it's more than that.
Yeah, 'cause-
Now it's the bacteria. Now it's the coral secreting mucus. And then certain types of bacteria grow on that.
Right.
Which gets into the whole thing about the studies now where if a reef gets overtaken by macroalgae, they're secreting a type of organic that gets broken down very efficiently. First time I heard about this, I think Julian was speaking at a Reefapalooza. And so what happens is the water, the organic level drops because there's so much bacteria that can break these organics down so fast, but the numbers of bacteria climb rapidly. Compared to if there was no macroalgae and the corals, the main organic going in the water is from the corals themselves, which are these complex like polysaccharide mucus molecules, they get broken down much slower. So the DOC level is a little higher, but the microbial, I think it's called the microbialization of reefs.
That's very
So that, but where you have the situation with the macroalgae, you're tending to get more pathogens in that water. Now, we talked about this on Facebook. I'm not saying we shouldn't use macro.
Argument. Right, yeah.
Remember, we're making a model, and it's
Right.
it's operating completely different.
So what do you
and the main
suggest-
thing is the surface area to volume of water ratio. So it could be on a natural reef, you have so much water that a lot of microbial things are happening in the water column. But in our tanks, because the ratio of bacteria, it could be much more on the surfaces, the water column isn't affected as much. You know, it's almost like when you cycle a tank, the water goes cloudy, you get a bacterial bloom, but eventually all of these substrate bacteria populate, and then all of a sudden your water goes clear. Same kind of thing.
So where does this bring you on water changes?
Yeah.
Well, I think so.
he's
What?
pro.
So we've come full circle. I think the water changes are doing just from our own intuitive observations over the years. It's helping as far as something with the bacteria. It could have to do with the lowering of dissolved organics. I mean, activated carbon is probably the best thing we could use to lower dissolved organics. And skimming takes a little out, but we're not getting it all out. We still see those yellow. You know, you're never gonna get that
Everybody's
water
gonna be
looking like that
cranking
newly
o-
mixed water.
o-
But
cranking ozone.
with that's exactly the next thing.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I think if you can break those yellowing compounds down with ozone, and the ozone doesn't completely oxidize. It just it shortens the molecular weight, and there's studies to show when that happens.
They get skimmed out easier.
And bacteria can now break it down.
Yeah.
You're doing the job that the bacteria couldn't do anymore, and now the bacteria, you cut up my food for me, thank you.
Well,
So,
this
there's that
also,
going on.
also leads into the question of we've talked about the old tank syndrome for years.
Right.
Do you think you get allelopathy where you get only certain strains in there, so from time to time you have to re-inoculate the tank with bacteria so that they do break all this stuff down, because only the dominant ones were there. So if you introduce something different, the bacteria that are necessary to break it down are no longer present.
I'm very skeptical of all of these bottled
I'm not saying
bacteria.
commercial, I'm saying add live rock.
From yes,
Add a piece of live rock.
Possibly, but there could just be an innate problem with the system that it's just build up too much gunk.
Yeah.
There's just too much detritus in the sand, and you know they've done studies on these bottled bacteria, and I'm not saying they don't work. The bottled bacteria, I've heard so many people say, my cyano went away when I used it. I just don't think those are strains that establish themselves and stay in the tank. So if they're going to be useful, like in aquaculture, they have to be added on a regular basis.
Well, that's runs
But they don't. They
counterintuitive.
can't do everything
Yeah,
because,
but if
like
they
the golf course, right? There's a study on a golf course pond, and they have to dredge these things out once in a while. So a lot of these bacterial products they dump in there, and they think, this, and they work, but they don't eliminate the need to dredge it. It just extends the period of time. So they're doing what they say, but they're not so good that they're just going to take care of all the organics. You still got to clean your sandbed.
Yeah, but the question I have with the bacteria, if you have to add it regularly, bacteria, once you introduce it, if the environment is conducive to their survival,
Exactly.
you should never have to add them again.
Right.
But, I mean, I realize they have to make money, so they tell you to add it every week,
Right.
every 2 weeks or whatever.
Right.
Which is it? That's the question.
So-
and why won't they tell us which strains are there?
Well, that was my question. What bacteria are we talking about?
I'm saying, but we don't even know what bacteria we need.
Well, a
That's
lot of
gonna be
those,
the
I can
next
tell you, a lot of
thing
those are bacillus, lactobacillus.
Right.
You know,
Some of the
they're very,
probiotic stuff.
right.
Right.
But you just hit on a key thing, prebiotics. The prebiotic conditions required to maintain the healthy biome. pH affects it. The amount of organics that build up in the tank can affect it. I mean, there's studies that show where they've looked at the sediments that are coming from the effluent of a fish farm into a bay, and then they just take core samples further and further from it. And their text, actually, it's rare that they test redox in a lot of these papers because of the finickiness of it.
Right.
But they actually were doing redox values of the
sand,
sediment.
in the
Yes.
sand, yeah.
And the lower the redox was obviously closest to the effluent because it had the most gunk in it.
Right.
The direct correlation between pathogenic bacteria in the low redox, nasty sand versus as they moved out like closer to the reef.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty good reason to think about maybe we should be cleaning our sand beds or and have
Or having fish clean our sand beds, or having
if
organisms in there.
Anything that'll prevent that buildup, probably helps. So it gets into these conditions, and the organic level is a big one. A big one.
I'm going to sum it up,
there's-
Bob. Water changes help the organic situation, you
Absolutely.
think,
Well,
and
it's definitely
therefore
diluting
still
it.
play an important part
Right.
of maintaining a healthy tank.
And if you're not doing
Is that-
ice, yes,
is that it?
I believe so.
Okay.
And,
We got the answer.
We got the answer.
and one other thing, we all talk about water changes supplement elements. Well, they'll supplement for that
Some.
volume of water
Yeah.
if you're replacing what was depleted.
Right.
But they also could lower elements that
That are
went too
bad.
high.
That were bad.
Right.
And that's maybe one of the biggest reasons. Because
Yeah.
if we're not doing all these ICPs, that could be that something was getting too high.
Right.
Well, that leads us to
As long as you trust your salt, that it's better than the tank.
That you're not going to have surprises
Correct.
from batch to batch.
no. And what's interesting is looking at all the various salts that are out there. If you look at the major trace elements, every single one of them is different. None of them are
Right.
the same between salt mix, which one makes it difficult to switch from salt to salt, but two, why is that?
Well, there's always some impurities. Even in you buy USP grade, they all have allowable heavy metal amounts and things like this. So actually, most of our stuff is food grade. Food grade, actually, they may not look at things that we don't care about too much that USP grade would look at, calcium, magnesium impurities, but they're very strict about heavy metals. And I've actually seen FCC food grade assays where they're more stringent than USP. So, but that's the main reason is you have these elements you can't control now. We have a great thing going.
In the mines.
You're hard.
Right.
Look at the way these things are being made.
That's one reason. Yeah.
Right, but you still need to add. So we have a nice little thing going where you're already testing all these ICPs, and I'll just bring that up a little bit, and it stays pretty consistent.
This leads us to the question, which heavy metals are problematic? Because when you do regular ICPs, the two you see most frequently are lithium and aluminum. And
Not lithium, not real. Depends on your definition of heavy. Lithium is the lightest element.
it's the lightest
It's not
element,
really considered.
but you see it above where,
Yes.
quote unquote, it should
Yes.
be. That's what I mean.
Right.
But you typically don't see tin, you don't see arsenic, you don't see copper to some degree. I mean, but those are the two that are typically way off the scale. You may have those others a little off the scale, but those are the two that your other things are down here, they're up here, particularly aluminum.
And what Bob's also suggesting is maybe if you tested the sandbed,
Yes.
Yeah.
that the heavy metal count would be different
If
than
you
the water
look-
column in the ICP.
If you look at the way they test coral reefs that are close to cities, anthropological sources of heavy metals, it's rare that they check the water column because a lot of these, what I think are the worst elements, like lead, cadmium, all that stuff,
Right.
that stuff doesn't like to be in the water column. It immediately adheres to
And precipitates
particulates.
off. Yep.
It gets into the sediments. It builds in the sediments. Now visualize this. You have these heavy metals building in a sediment, but you have organisms in the sediment. You have invertebrates that have planktonic stages. They're releasing the planets, and those plankton, the larval forms, have high levels of bioaccumulated heavy metals, and now the corals are eating them. So what they really test is the sediments and the corals. They actually dissolve coral and have the equipment to analyze what the levels are. So is that happening in our tanks? You remember who brought this up? It was Ron Shimmick.
Yep.
Many years ago.
That would argue.
That whole
that would
sand bed-
argue for the sand bed, go bare bottom or changing the
Well,
sand
make sure
bed.
if you're doing a water change, siphon the
Yeah,
sand.
siphoning
That
sand
junk
bed.
should come out. So it gets into, which is the conundrum of, if you're using a calcium chloride, one method of manufacture is they're dissolving shells and natural calcium carbonate sources. Those usually have higher like cadmium and lead, but you won't find lithium or bromide. So the other method of manufacture, which is what we use, you'll see a little elevated lithium and bromide, but you'll see non-detectable heavy metals. So my judgment call is, looking at the toxicity of lithium and bromide, if you go to MSDS sheets, look at those LD50 values, and think about this. My calcium chloride meets food grade.
Right.
Lithium's like
the
sodium,
FCC
right?
doesn't care too much about lithium and bromide.
Right.
But if your heavy metals go over,
Right, cadmium and lead.
From my supplier of my calcium chloride, he's told me, because I brought this up, how come we can't get these levels of lithium? Because then the heavy metals will go up. And even though they'll fall in spec, there's actually manufacturers that will pick the one with the higher lithium and bromide. So lithium bromide, very soluble. You'll see it in the water. I mean,
The studies that you can handle, like lithium could go to 1,000 and it wouldn't bother anything.
higher.
Right.
Chile
Right.
is the number one source where they mine lithium. Do you know what the seawater level is around, especially in the estuaries there? It's 7 parts per million. That's really high.
Right.
If you look at, and that people are eating the fish, even though it looks like your heavy metals are fine in the water column. So this is something maybe now that we have all this ICP test, this is something we could maybe look at again. Some people argue, no, it's not a problem because the organics make the
By the way,
heavy metal less toxic.
Polo has already now sent samples last week that are different. We actually took sandbed samples versus.
Did you pull it through a micron
Yes,
filter?
we did. Yes, we did. And we'll see what the results say.
Right, which is the other interesting thing, I think, with the MS.
I
Aren't your
think we
samples
just sent it.
Your sample's going through a 0.2 micron thing,
Yes,
so
it is.
it's filtering out
Yes,
the
it is.
bacteria and everything.
Right,
like
so you're
that.
not having bacterial
And,
breakdown
and we
before
sent
it gets
after
and
tested.
we sent one that wasn't filtered.
Ooh, I got to see that. That's going to be interesting.
Now, as we've gotten more ICP samples and looked at more trace elements, have you changed any formulation on the salt at all to add or improve some of the trace elements
Yes.
that we're finding more important?
Yes. I mean, Andrew's sending all of these ICPs out, and I make small batches. So if I'm in there at, or maybe slightly lower than the minimal amount recommended, which there's still controversy over that, if he wants me to come up a little bit, it's not a big deal. I can add that. And that's what I do. And if I do that, that's for everybody. But it's, again, how important really is that?
Because
as
we
those
don't
levels.
know whether it's being
Right.
taken up by the water
Right.
column or food.
Right.
But in the case, in my opinion, why some of the elevated trace element systems work well is because we don't have the right food in here anyway. So
good
we
point.
need the extra trace elements in the water column for the coral.
Even though it
In
may
my
not be the
opinion,
best way.
It may not be the best way.
Right.
Right.
Because as we've discussed ad nauseum, there's no literature showing that the corals are taking up the trace elements directly. It's all the bacteria. This gets us into the microbiome, trace elements. How are we going to optimize what the corals take up without affecting the rest of the tank? That is, what's your feelings on us working more with the bacteria and the microbiome rather than just doing this, throw in a handful of food, throw in a handful of trace elements, and hope for the best?
Well, this whole idea of culturing bacteria external of the tank and adding the carbon sources to that, and I've got something here we've been working on for a year. I showed you, and there's some other things now I think popping up on
Concoctions, they call them.
Various concoctions.
kind of like shotgun approaches, but
Yeah.
that concept is worth looking at, I think. So if that might be the answer, is if we can, in enough quantity, culture things and make it easy,
And
make that a
and
food.
not contaminate.
right? And exactly, and not have pathogenic bacteria. So the
Risk.
bacteria are cultured in a a situation and an environment. You never really hear people getting
And the hobbyists can buy
food
them
poisoning from
readily.
kimchi.
I mean,
Right. You don't get food
if you're
poisoning from
making
fermented
this
products.
concoction,
Right.
You're saying to me it's one of the most difficult things you've ever done in this hobby, and it's one big PIA.
It's not a PIA so much as it's the learning curve, like from the beginning, when we didn't realize how important keeping the salinity close and how important alkalinity was. Because remember, in the early years, we looked at calcium. We never tested
But is the
alkalinity.
average hobbyist going to grow this concoction?
I don't know if they're going to grow it, but I'm sure someone will eventually manufacture it so they can do it.
my
gotta
point.
be-
That's my
That's
point.
way
that's
of-
what will happen, because when
You
there's
gotta make
money
a
to be
kit,
made
like
and
a
something
kit.
worthwhile, there'll be a kit. You mix this, and this.
That's
you stir it up,
there
aerate
you
it.
go.
Sound familiar? Oh.
Like, I mean,
There you
what am
go.
I using? Where am I putting my concoction right now? But I'm using the San Francisco Bay brine shrimp hatchery. Why? It's a 2-liter
Right.
bottle sitting on
Right.
top of an air stone. It keeps everything in circulation. All I do is take out a scoop or two, a couple hundred milliliters of the concoction, put it in, add more food, add more bacteria or whatever else I want to add a carbon source. It just keeps taking care of itself. It basically, it's not as hard as keeping phytoplankton, because I don't think it's
Right.
going to crash.
Right.
But
Okay, so it's somewhere between that and Fido. I got it.
yeah,
But if
so
you're-
but every
if
month
you-
or two, I'm gonna break it down. I've just started doing this a couple weeks ago. Once a month, I'm gonna tear it down and start another. Right now, I'm running two of them
To sterilize it.
to sterilize it.
If you're using it and then you top it off with fresh salt water,
Right.
and then are you adding all those other things back, or are you just adding the carbon source?
I'm primarily adding the carbon source, some food, either Benepets
Oh,
or
even in the top off.
even in the top
Right,
off.
right.
So I'm supplying the bacteria with food.
Right.
And the things I'm going to look at down the line are adding trace elements to it to see if that makes a difference.
Right.
Adding other components to it, because the bacteria will consume virtually anything.
But remember, like we were talking about earlier before this, those foods are loaded with trace elements.
Right.
And it's very possible the bacteria are getting more than you're going to even add, and you'd have to be careful you didn't add something that would kill the bacteria.
Right.
So,
but
you know,
I'm adding stuff like manganese, because everyone
Right.
has seen good results with manganese, particularly for like gonioporas and coloration and acros. So right now I've started adding manganese for the last week.
right. It's
Simply to
worth
see
all cool things to play with.
the thing that will upset people is they're going to add this and they're going to expect a miracle overnight.
How long have you been doing this?
I've been doing it for about 3 months.
Are you saving the surprise for the article, or you going to tell us how it's going?
It's going well, but there have been surprises in that I overdosed it once and brought my nutrient levels from
extra-
high levels
Right.
down to nothing.
See, that's interesting.
Literally overnight.
Is that the bacteria doing that?
Or the carbon
Or
source?
the carbon sources
Or
that are
both.
going in, or both?
I'm only adding roughly 10 milliliters of vodka. When I was carbon sourcing, I was adding 100 milliliters of vodka to the tank. So
So-
I don't think it's the.
So, but
it's
what
the
I'm
carbon
getting
source.
into is when you put like the Benepets and all that stuff in, the bacteria, as they're oxidizing that, they don't just turn it into CO2. They're
No.
breaking it down into amino acids and
Right.
things. And that's carbon.
Right.
So you could have more carbon
I could
in
have a
there
stronger carbon
than you
source.
realize.
Yeah.
And that's what's causing it in the tank.
But I
We
also
don't
added
know.
I also added more than I usually did. Usually I add 200 milliliter
Right.
batches. In this case, I was about to break down the system. I go, you know what? I'm going to add all this and see what happens. I saw what happens. It wasn't good.
Right. Well,
I lost about 6 corals as a result of that stress
The
of that.
stuff that I've been working on, I noticed
Hold
the
that
same
up.
thing.
Hold that up to the camera.
I noticed the same thing. This is kind of like a. This is.
had
You use this.
had
Oh, I gave you a pan.
There was a
because
pan.
right.
There was a pan.
Because there's a zooplankton, living zooplankton organism in here, and it's like a little mini food chain. So it's probiotic bacteria cultured under conditions at a lower pH, which to me is more of your assurance you're not going to get pathogens. That's my one worry.
I have a question on that.
That's my one worry is if you raise the pH, now you're just growing these heterotrophic bacteria. You don't really know what they are. Hopefully the bacteria
Hopefully,
you added,
Vibrio doesn't get in there.
it's possible because
you
there's
use a bucket, a bucket that has something in it, and then you take new salt water, but the bucket has
Something
something
contaminated.
contaminated in it.
Yeah.
and-
plus
and
you're
now
putting
it's not
animal.
new
You're
salt
putting
water.
Right.
You're putting animal protein in there. That's always risky, and you have an air stone that's bringing spores in.
Yeah,
into
you're
the
there,
plant.
and we'll get
But
into
it
we'll get
might
into
be
some,
fine.
one
It
other
might
thing
be
in one
fine.
second. But one thing you said was at a lower pH. But the literature shows that at a lower pH, pathogenic bacteria tend to thrive over a higher pH on the reef. I have the paper.
That's a whole different issue. 'Cause
Okay.
the pHs that you're talking about are in the realm of what 7.5 to 8. right?
Yeah.
And I agree. On a reef, if the pH gets too low, you can get pathogens.
Right.
When we're talking about culturing concentrated bacteria, this stuff
4.0
gets down to 4.
Oh, okay.
At 4, only that bacteria pretty much
Right.
can survive. Plus, that bacteria secretes competitive things to keep, pathogens out,
Right.
which is the whole basic concept behind most of the probiotics we eat.
Well,
all
it's
that,
also why you don't
all the
get sick eating
lactobacillus,
kimchi or other fermented products. They're also at a pH of around 4.
which is keeping the pathogens away.
Right.
So that's a different issue.
Okay.
So I think there's been confusion
Yeah,
about
that's
that in
what I
this
wanted to
method.
clarify.
When you're adding the calcium carbonate to bring the pH up, now you're bringing it up to the realm where you might get pathogens like you would on a reef. But if it stays low, and there's a way of doing it where it stays low. So that's what I've been playing.
Someone's got to make
That's
a
what I've been playing around.
3-part thing that you can put together with a little with a little thing. Someone's got to simplify this.
I'll have it for you.
for the hobby.
You basically still San Francisco Bay's brine shrimp culturing thing. You have one of probiotics and bacteria. You have one of food, and you have one of enzymes, trace elements, amino acids.
Right.
You mix the 3 together. You bubble it up. There's our future.
Could be.
I just
Could
think it
be.
could be made simpler because
Even simpler.
because having just like a macroalgae powdered that contains all those things. It contains the trace elements. It contains the amino acids.
And then you just pour the powder in.
And then
into salt water.
if you culture that with the bacteria, they'll absorb those.
I
things.
have 5 different kinds of dried
It's cool that
seaweed
you
at home.
can play around with different things.
I will do a batch with that and see if I see anything
Right.
different. Because the goal is not to have it smell, not to have something that looks or goes anoxic, hence the air bubbling, and 2, that it doesn't decompose and turn into a sludge.
Right, but there's a different type of fermentation that can be done in a sealed bottle, where you just have to shake it to spread. But you avoid all of those problems.
Yeah, but
and that's basically what.
If you're depending on hobbyists to have a sealed bottle and shake it 3 times a day, you're making it more difficult than having a bubbler where they just take it off and do what I'm doing.
The wife is smelling it.
I'm
It's
not allowed to
complete-
put
I've been
smelly
doing
stuff
this.
in the
This is-
fridge,
this
so
is
you
very
have to have
easy.
your own fridge.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
The big issue
That's not
is
even. That's like a standard in this industry.
the
Yeah.
big issue is
Your own
you
separate
created
fridge.
an environment that where you could get some pathogens in there, and the fermentation in the sealed thing, you're eliminating that. You might be able to take the fermentation stuff and right before you add it, pour that in, aerate it, just to bring the pH, and then use it right away. But as far as storage, like this stuff could be put in the fridge, and it will last for a year. So you could stockpile it, and you won't need this apparatus.
That would be
There's other
interesting.
tricks. There's other tricks to this that will come out.
Okay.
So there's,
Yeah,
there's some
like I said,
interesting things ESV's working on.
We're still,
We've been working on
we're
it.
still
I-
in we're still in the infancy of understanding the
Right.
microbiome and feeding.
bottom-
As we get to wrapping this up, because we've been
Right.
signaled that the time is almost over.
Yes.
We're approaching springtime,
Right.
and in spring, a lot of tanks have a lot of issues.
Yes.
What is your?
I never went through this.
You have it basically sealed, but people that have windows open,
I guess.
or that open up after the winter,
This is the whole pollen issue.
possibly
Maybe?
pollen, possibly some pathogens. I have no idea. I always said it was pollen because I have literally taken pollen and put it by corals.
Yeah, they don't like it.
They do not like it at all.
Yeah, I don't know, but I've heard that so many times that you just told me that it's a spring thing, and I have people talk to me like swear it's pollen. But if you just think about like the ocean and how the chemistry is affected by dust and stuff, like iron comes over in dust clouds and fertilizes the whole area. So we are kind of vulnerable to what could be in the air. But
I think we're definitely vulnerable, but it's curious how it happens literally every spring.
it's a thing.
And I even have a couple shops that basically don't open their doors for the first April and
believe
May.
it. I
They turn
believe
their
it.
air conditioning on because they've had so many issues with their tanks.
I've heard this. I've heard it.
I'm not sure I've ever experienced it. Maybe my air conditioning system is too good.
Could be.
Or it can't get in.
Yeah, that's more
You have
most
more
closed
of a
system. You don't have an
controlled
open
environment.
top system
Yeah.
like most of us have.
Right.
You have a
Yeah.
more controlled environment
Yeah.
in this whole place. So
Well, we have more to come later this
Oh, yeah.
afternoon when we
We're just
add
getting
Craig
warmed
to
up.
our list.
Yeah,
But
I really
this-
appreciate you coming in, Bob.
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Mike, for heading this up, this discussion. Thank you for. I know you don't do many of these.
This is it.
The last attempt didn't go good, but But
It was a good attempt.
But
I had a great time.
yeah, we had fun. We had
wonderful
fun.
time.
We had fun.
Yeah.
But you don't
I really
remember
got
it.
to know you.
And click and subscribe to the YouTube channel where you can find this material. Stay tuned for more. Thank you, guys.